Customer complained that they drove from Ottawa, Canada to Texas. I think it was like 3,600 miles. Once they got to Texas, the vehicle asked to add 2 quarts of oil. So that was pretty startling for the customers. So they added the oil, drove all the way from Houston to Phoenix, and it asked again for more oil. So they brought it here. Turbocharged engine, and there's an acceptable amount of oil consumption. And the spec is after 750 miles, it's acceptable to consume 1 liter of oil. So I did the math for their first trip from Canada to Texas. Technically, the car should have asked for 4 quarts of oil, and it only asked for 2. It was actually well within spec for oil consumption. But what triggered me to continue going further is the shorter trip, which is basically half the distance from Canada to Texas. They went from Texas to Arizona. That asked for 2 as well, which that is right on the spec. But in my eyes, it actually increased oil consumption. End game is I found it needs a turbo. But what I did find in the front side before I got to the turbo is this is a crankcase pipe. And it goes from the fresh air to the valve cover, which the valve cover is the crankcase. Now, this car's package, what it was built with, this is a hot climate car. But they don't live in a hot climate, they live in an extremely cold climate. Now, this is supposed to have a heater, but this is the hot climate crankcase pipe. So it actually has a connector, and right now it's not doing anything. It plugs into here, and this pipe goes in here like that and makes this connection. Hot packaged cars don't have a heater integrated into this pipe. The reason why this is important for this customer where they live is when you're at temperatures at and around freezing or below, cold temperatures will actually increase the crankcase pressure. So they would actually have a heater inside this that would actually help balance and lower the crankcase pressure. Because what happened is, because this car is not outfitted with that, and it got very cold, it started to blow oil out of the cap. So the crankcase pressure increased so dramatically that it essentially like lifted the cap up and let oil spill out. And it also blew out this seal here on the valve cover. And this is all crankcase pressure in here. So it found a way to relieve pressure, and luckily it blew the seals on the cover and not, say, the pan or the rear or front oil main seals for the crankshaft, because that's typically what I see, but it didn't blow those, it came out of here. Because what happens is this killed the turbo, okay? So in this engine, it's kind of weird, so they don't have a ball bearing turbo like most other turbochargers. This has a floating bearing, okay? So the bearing is supported, it's lifted by oil pressure and then supported by crankcase pressure on each side of it, and it actually will float the bearing and keep it stable. But when you have a bad crankcase pressure, the bearing will chatter, and that's what happened here. The bearing chattered, and it caused the impeller fins on the fresh air side to scrape the wall of the turbo because it got loose. But what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do a retrofit. So I'm actually going to update the vehicle software and replace this pipe so it actually has the heater in it. So it'll have pins, and it'll have a heating element in this pipe to prevent that from ever happening again, because this is a snowbird customer coming from Canada, leaving the harsh winter, coming to Arizona for the better winter. But there's always that time period up there where it's gonna get really cold anyway, or before he comes down for that. So that's what happened. So this is the pipe right off the turbo, and this is like metal particles and oil in here. So not good. Because of what happened, I checked the catalyst out. So this is the backside of the honeycomb structure. Looks good. Because I was worried oil was going through it, because oil will tear that up. So this is the backside of the turbo. This is the hot side. This actually looks really good. Now here's the front of the catalyst. And that looks good. This is the turbo side. So you look here, this is oil, and then this is the housing of the turbo, and this is the fins, and it's contacting, and you'll see that I'll show the top of it, and there's a bigger gap. So there's the top. So see how you can clearly see a gap up here, and then when I was showing the other end, and then again, here's just more oil. So this side is bouncing around essentially, and this, when it's bouncing, it's letting oil in, and it's filling up the inner, so this is the intercooler, and you can't tell, but that's pooled oil right there. And it actually should be there's like an inch below that. And then here is some more metal shavings. This is not the first time I've seen this, unfortunately. A lot of the times in our climate in Arizona, this pipe will crack because it's a corrugated plastic pipe, and it'll develop cracks in it. So then it bleeds crankcase pressure, and then that does the same thing. No crankcase pressure, no support for the turbo bearing, and it just blows it out. This was caught like basically right now, so that hadn't happened yet. So I got to see just the beginning of it, if you will, but it's gonna get to that point where it'll tear the entire turbo up. But if that keeps going, it will contaminate the motor, and then you need the turbo and the engine. So that's why I'm hoping they go for it, because right now we're okay, we're safe. 60 miles ago, he was at a dealership for this complaint, and they didn't even look into anything. They just quoted him oil consumption diagnosis, which is just pouring in a very specific amount of oil into the engine, driving it for 750 miles, and then draining it and measuring it. But like, that doesn't tell you what or who's consuming. It just lets them know there's a consumption. The numbers that the customer told me is within spec, so I don't even know why they went after it like that. As a former BMW tech, and I do at Diag, that they should have done, I think, themselves. So it's like now I'm worried it's gonna set doubt in the customer's mind, because the dealer was telling them this thing, and they always think the dealership is like the kingpin of the whole industry. But I know, because I've worked there, that is not the case. I've put myself throughout the industry at places where it's like, if I worked at a few shops that are like that, like the old stuff, where they take advantage of people, and I don't work there. I leave. That's not my style. So I bounced around a little bit until I found a place like this, like the Benz shop, where it's like there's none of that going on here, where everybody has integrity and professionalism. So that way, I don't work around or amongst people that operate that way, where they lie, So a lot of times we'll get a car that has been to 3 other shops. And these other shops are just throwing parts at it, and they don't fix the concern. They don't fix the car, but they still charge the customer for all the parts, all the labor, and they didn't fix it. All those faults were in front of all the other shops, but they decided to ignore them. I don't like that. In a video that we made earlier, is like I said, if we don't fix your car, we're not gonna charge you. Well, they're not just gonna force you to buy these parts that you didn't need. That's just the big issue in the field. It's like if you go to another shop and they don't fix it, you're not paying. I don't get how even the customers themselves are okay with just taking a car that wasn't fixed with a bunch of parts it didn't need. That's frustrating for me.